Yes, the next speaker we have is Amy Lewis, the Vice President of the Wild Foundation, and she will speak about the barriers to capturing mass public attention and enthusiasm for wilderness. And we look forward to this presentation with regards to how wilderness can be spread out to the wider public. So whenever you are ready, Amy.
Hi, thank you so much for inviting me to be a panelist, and I'm super excited to be here. As I was just introduced, I'll be presenting on, well, the title of my presentation is Disinterest is the Enemy. And let me go ahead and do that screen share right now. Let's see, there we go. Okay, I hope everyone can see that just fine. And I guess my journey to this topic and to this career that I'm in began when I was 9 years old. And I didn't really come from an environmental family. We loved to camp and be outdoors, but there wasn't really, I would say, a strong environmental ethic there. That being said, when I was 9 years old, for whatever reason, bats really captured my attention. And it was a special feature about bats that I was enamored with, and that was their pollination capacity and the fact that they planted rainforests and they helped enhance crop yields, and they had this beautiful synergistic relationship with the environment around them, including human settlements. And I loved this idea. And I was convinced at the age of 9, and I was aware that bat populations were suffering around the world. And I was utterly and completely convinced that if only everybody else on the planet knew what I knew about bats, the plight of bats everywhere would end, and suddenly we would have abundant bat populations once again. So I began my own little bat campaign, going door to door, raising money for bats, educating my neighborhood on the benefits of bats. And, you know, at first I just had so much hope and optimism, but within a few short weeks, I drew the conclusion that despite all of my efforts and enthusiasm for bats, no one else really cared. And for some reason, the population I was speaking to, mostly people in Southern California where I grew up, just didn't really get pollination. They didn't really care. They thought it was interesting. I could tell that they were trying to appease me, but they didn't care about the relationship that we have by default with this species, with these 1,300 species, I should say. So I had just this overwhelming sense of disappointment and this belief that suddenly, you know, that trying to change things was futile. If people wouldn't listen to the facts, what would they listen to? And I was just convinced for a couple of months that bats were going to die because no one cared. But after this period of depression, I think I began to become interested at this very young age in what type of information it does take for people to start to care and for people to change their behavior. And I've been on a lifelong journey ever since, pursuing that. And I by no means think I have all the answers, but I have learned a couple of lessons along the way that I wanted to share with you, which will be in this presentation. So, disinterest is the enemy, harnessing the power of myth to save the biosphere. So, in my role at Wild, I work a lot with the Nature Needs Have network. And I'm working with an international team to figure out how we can set aside half of Earth's land and seas to save the biospheres. And I'm obviously working on the communication side of this issue. We ask ourselves this question a lot: how much nature do people need in order to survive? And the scientific consensus looks like, you know, approximately half, at least half in many cases. In some cases more when you look at fragile ecosystems like the rainforest, etc. But in my own work on this issue, I ask myself, what kind of stories do humans need to survive? And I don't think I'm the only person asking this question. A few years ago, a gentleman named Harari wrote a book called *Sapiens*. I hope that many of you have read it. It's a very fascinating book, but in it, he demonstrates the power of fiction, of the imagination, and of stories. And he says that basically the creative power of humanity is really what distinguishes it, and is really the foundation of our civilizations. And it's the stories that we tell each other that have enabled us to get as far as we have. Because we can look into the future and we can imagine something that doesn't currently exist, and then we can use that imagining and that vision to work our way towards it and actually manifesting something brand new. And this has to do with the power of stories. So stories are absolutely integral to our civilization and probably to our species. So what kind of stories do humans need to survive? In order to answer this question, I looked back at some of the oldest stories we have, at least some of the oldest written stories. And of course, the first one of those stories is Gilgamesh. Gilgamesh is the story of two men who become human. One is a wild man who comes in from the wilderness. The other is a god king who befriends the wild man. And together, through friendship and through learning about their own vulnerability and mortality, they become human. And Gilgamesh is not unique. It is really our first written story. But if you look back at many cultures from around the world, you will see that their first stories have to do with what it means to be human. And as a part of that, our heroes in those stories are monster hunters. They're going out into the wilderness and they're hunting monsters, and they're dealing with the consequences of that. And I'll get into the monster hunting aspect of this in just a second. But if you look at Gilgamesh and you look at these other stories and the heroic monster hunting aspect of them, the first thing you notice about them is that they're exciting. Okay, our first stories, stories that have defined our civilization, they're exciting. And I don't know about you, but sometimes I can be a little bit of a snob and a little bit smug about my own academic credentials and being an intellectual and blah, blah, blah. And sometimes I personally eschew exciting stories because it's just not the done thing. It's much better, to go read James Joyce or something than to open up a comic book. But I've noticed, even in my own case, I am not immune to the magnetic attraction of a good, exciting story. And case in point, when I was studying for my PhD exams in political science, and I was super nervous about these exams. I'd been studying for 6 months. The people who'd taken them before me had failed, and I had huge respect for those individuals. So I was very, very nervous. But about 2 weeks before my exams occurred, I just couldn't read another word. I couldn't take another note. And everyone was talking about that. I knew they were all talking about this new series on HBO called Game of Thrones. And, I'd listen to them and I'd kind of roll my eyes and be like, oh, I have so many better things to do. Like go read about like the history of bureaucracy or whatever. But I was so tired, so exhausted. I was like, you know what? I'm just going to check out this Game of Thrones thing for 5 minutes. 5 minutes, that's it. And then I'm going to get back to studying. Well, 36 hours later, I had watched the entire first season of Game of Thrones. And the only thing that stopped me from watching more is that the second season had not come out yet. Okay, so even if we don't like to admit it, I think most of us crave and love a good, exciting story. It's just magnetic. And these exciting stories is what helps capture the human imagination, capture attention, and spread the message of that story to a wider audience. So that's lesson 1. Lesson 2, there's science behind this, right? The reason exciting stories work is they leverage the power of the stress response. The stress response is something that is evolutionarily hardwired into all of us. Those of us individuals who are going to be more successful are going to hone in our attention laser-like on anything that's causing stress, because that will allow us to escape from predators or to survive a famine or whatever. So when we see exciting stories that oftentimes involve very stressful elements, evolutionarily speaking, we can't avoid those. So there's other reasons why exciting stories work, but biologically, this is one reason why exciting stories are so effective at capturing our attention. Now, I know that there's problems with videos. I'm going to do my best to show this video. If not, I'll share the link in chat afterwards. But what I'm going to show is a very famous ad for Apple Computer that took place in 1984. And what's remarkable about this ad is that it's just how exciting it is, because they're selling a computer product, right? They could sit there and talk to us about all the features and binary coding and what distinguishes this technically from some other computer program, but they eschew all of that and they go straight for the myth. So I'm going to play this really quickly just to demonstrate how it is you can impose excitement and myth over an otherwise technical product.
Today we celebrate the first glorious anniversary of the information purification directives. Created for the first time in all history, a garden of pure ideology, where each worker may bloom, secure from the pests of any contradictory influence. Purification, of course, is more powerful a weapon than any fleet or army on earth. We are one people, with one will, one resolve, one cause. Our enemies shall talk themselves to death, and we will bury them with their own confusion. We shall prevail.
On January 24th, Apple Computer will introduce Macintosh. And you'll see why 1984 won't be like 1984.
So Apple, in all of its innovation, they went straight for the myth. They went straight for the mythic aspects of what they were trying to sell. And they eschewed the technical aspects and the features, etc. And I think that this is a good example for conservation, because so much of our work is technical, and yet just because it's technical doesn't mean it's immune to myth. Okay, so lesson 2. Stories that capture our attention or grab our attention are character-based. When Gilgamesh sets out on his epic quest for immortality, he's motivated by the longing to restore his best friend to life. And an individual's authentic desire, whether good or bad, has an almost gravitational hold on our attention. When I'm consulting on how to tell stories, what I tell people is really a good story involves only 2 aspects. It involves an individual, whether you're hero or anti-hero, who has a strong desire, and it involves the obstacles to achieving that desire. And whether that individual actually achieves their desires, whether they fail, whatever, determines if it's a comedy or a tragedy. But ultimately, that's all you need to capture the human attention: an individual with a desire and the obstacles to achieving that. Now, there's a reason why individuals are the basis of the best stories, the stories that we need to survive, versus other types of entities, groups or hive minds or whatever. And that has to do with our biology as well. When scientists have gone in and they've looked at brain scans of individuals listening to different types of information, what they have found is where empathy originates from, at least in the biological sense. And empathy seems to come from what is called mirror neurons in our brain. And when they start to fire, we start to actually mirror the emotions and sometimes even the motor, the motor sensations and actions of the people we're observing. Mirror neurons are activated when we observe others express emotion and when individuals express emotion. When we see somebody that is crying or laughing, we are more likely to experience those emotions as well. This effect does not happen with groups. It doesn't happen if we say that, you know, something out there is being destroyed, like a rainforest or whatever, and that's really sad. When empathy starts to emerge is when we actually start observing individuals experiencing those emotions. Okay, lesson 3, whoops. Let me go back here. I'm not sure, back, okay. Lesson 3 is stories that endure tell us who we are. They strike right at the heart of identity, individual identity and communal identity. And it's probably no coincidence that the oldest stories involve monster hunting and slaying. I said I'd get back to this. Because after all, when you define a monster, you are implicitly begin to define what it means to be human, or at least what it means to not to be inhuman, right? For starters, humans are not monsters. And the rest of the story fills in the other aspirational details that might inform a community what it is they should be striving as individuals to become. Identity is important for a lot of different reasons that I'll get into a little later in the presentation. But one of the reasons, rooted in biology again, is that when we start speaking in the second person, when we start referring to a you, or relating information to you as an individual, brain activity begins to spike. It gets really, really high, and we're really paying attention to that. When we speak of a friend or a loved one, that brain activity actually significantly decreases. So people are still paying attention, but it's nothing like when you start striking at somebody's individual identity. And finally, when you speak of a group of people, even if that group is suffering something awful in some distant land or even nearby, brain activity declines again significantly, and it's almost non-existent. So you can only imagine what happens when you start talking about another species, or you start speaking of a landscape. It declines even more, because we're just not hardwired to pay attention to something so remote from us, even if our survival depends on something like that. It's just hard for our brain to grasp that. So now let's examine what kind of stories conservation typically tells. And I'm saying this, and maybe some of you are dreading this part of like the talk, because you're like, oh my God, here's where she gets extra preachy and she tells me everything I've been doing wrong or whatever. And I want to let you know right up front that I am doing the same things you are doing. And I think many of us know better. I especially know better, but I'm doing those same things. And the reason for it is to tell a really good, compelling story, it requires a different orientation than our sector has and than many of our organizations have. It requires a lot of funding to do it well. It requires actually prioritizing that and gathering that specific type of information. And right now, the type of information we have, we've gathered for science communication. We've gathered to tell communicate more technical ideas, not to make myths. And so I too fall more into the category of science communicator right now, but I would like to see us as a sector shift into more myth making, doing the science communication as well, but shift more into myth making. And so just know that I am guilty of these sins as well. And I'm not trying to cast stones while I live in a glass house, or rather I am casting stones, but I know I live in a glass house and I know my house is going to shatter, and I'm totally okay with that. So conservation stories tend to prioritize objectivity. Okay, facts tend to be more important than entertainment. And that doesn't mean that our stories aren't entertaining. There's a lot of excellent science communicators out there, through sheer force of personality and through extraordinary teams, are able to make really entertaining stories. But still, the facts are what we prioritize. The idea of adding mythic elements to our story, as scientists, it's almost counter to everything we believe, right? Because objectivity is our God. and it's heresy to talk about myth. So, so we tend to be more objective oriented. We also tend to be more oriented around species and spaces. Groups are more important than characters, right? Because it's the survival of a species, it's the survival of a landscape, it's the survival of a forest, not the impact on little, Suleiman in a village and what he is experiencing, or not the impact on an individual female ranger who fought all sorts of adversity to become a ranger in her area, and now is just clinging on to like survival for herself and for the landscape that she's serving. No, because we're more objective and more group oriented. And finally, as opposed to focusing on identity, we focus on the exact opposite. We focus on the wider world and the environment we live in. Instead of telling stories about who we are, we tell stories about what is out there. And that's really good and it's needed, but it doesn't capture attention in the same way those other stories do. Now, recently, George Monbiot tweeted this, and I couldn't agree more with him. He said, "Every day people tell me, you should do this, you should do that. I've worked as an environmental journalist and campaigner for 35 years, and believe me, we have tried every imaginable means of provoking action, but we have been outspent by destructive industry." So I am not, as a political scientist especially, I am not in any way saying that what George Monbiot said isn't true. I think it's absolutely true, and we absolutely have to take into account power dynamics. However, we probably still can do a better job given those power dynamics, and we might be able to subvert them in some ways with the following tips. So the reason for this is that many times industrial interests, or whatever it is you want to call those forces that oppose conservation, they use our own communication techniques against us. When it comes to objectivity, they use that as a way to neutralize audiences. So because we're trying so hard to be objective and because we're trying so hard to be fact-oriented, they use our own necessary scientific uncertainty around things and the very technical nature of our work to keep an audience limited to a narrow audience. And let me tell you, we're not going to out special interest. When it comes to narrow audiences and influencing them, it's almost always going to be the group with the most money and the most influence over time that is going to succeed there. So we need to tell stories that expand audiences. When it comes to species and spaces, the opposition will often say, well, this is an issue, not a problem. And I'll get into why problems are necessary for us to succeed and issues end up tamping down, again, on audience participation. And then finally, when it comes to the wider world, we live in a post-fact era now. It's all about truthiness. And the opposition can oftentimes use, again, our own curiosity and hypotheses and very objective scientific lack of dogma and certainty to spread misinformation, to conflate debates among experts as debate about the actual presence of a problem. And so all of the ways we're actually communicating right now are very easy to subvert. Now, going into some of these points, first, getting into audience size and the objective versus the entertainment factor. My favorite political scientist, E.E. Schattschneider, wrote back in the 1960s that conflict is key. The outcome of every conflict is determined by the extent to which the audience becomes involved. The outcome of the political game depends upon the scale at which is it played. When we tell exciting stories, we automatically expand conflict, we expand attention, and we bring in a new audience that prevents special interest, powerful special interest, from operating as easily as they've done before. In terms of issues versus problems, issues are naturally occurring and they have no solution. So when our focus is on species and spaces, that information can oftentimes be subverted to say, oh, well, 65 million years ago, there was a meteor that struck the planet and all sorts of other things went extinct. So extinction is natural and we don't have to worry about it. Problems, however, are man-made and they're solvable. They're things that heroes can tackle. And so the more we can focus on a problem and impose man-made causes and solvable man-made solutions, the better off we're going to be. I have this image here of another modern myth and hero. This is Geralt Rivera from The Witcher. And I use this, one, because it's monster hunting, but two, because in that series, monsters are the unintended consequences of our bad and selfish behavior. And we care as an audience about those monsters, not because they're monsters killing people of questionable moral intent, but because Geralt, the hero, is angry about them and doesn't like them. And his passion for his occupation is what carries us through that story. In terms of identity versus environment focused stories, identity is proximate, it's immediate, it's irrelevant, it's a personal truth that is very hard to dismiss or deny. If somebody wants to be something or they feel some certain way, it's really hard to say, no, he doesn't actually feel that way. The environment, however, is remote, it's not urgent, it can oftentimes be irrelevant from a day-to-day point of view, and it's confusing. So it does not convey the kind of mythic quality that allows us to tell the stories humans need to mobilize. My example of this is this slide with some dinosaurs looking at the incoming meteor that's about ready to strike Earth and worried that it's going to destroy their economy. I don't know if any of you have noticed similar tendencies in this recent year, but I sure have. And it's so easy when we focus on the wider environment to distort issues and distort what the real issue is, what the real problem is, into something that it's not. So in conclusion, I think I'm going to finish just in time, sorry. In conclusion, I want to look at the role of scientific literacy and people's relationship with facts versus what it is they actually believe. So versus the role that culture and myth might play. So in the United States, 28% of the US population, it's a test that's been conducted for over 40 years, it's pretty credible. 28% of the US population right now is scientifically literate, and 49% believe climate change is man-made. In the EU, only 20% of the population is scientifically literate, but 58% believe that climate change is man-made. This suggests to me that there are variables outside of objectivity and facts that matter, and culture and stories play a very big part in that. So I have some sector-wide steps for change. I'm just going to cruise through here so I can conclude on time. But one, we need philanthropy to start supporting more mythic storytelling solutions. We need to prioritize this as much as we prioritize the science. We need focus on human programs that actually target the human problems, because we don't have an environmental problem, we have human problems. And we also need more expert bards and storytellers, professional myth makers who are as valued as scientists, who can bring that quality, that mythic quality, to our work as a sector. So that's my presentation. Thank you so much for listening. It was my pleasure to be here.
Brilliant. Thank you very much for your talk, Amy. And it's great to discover how discursive power is crucial in spreading our message and the conservation message that we want to spread to the whole world, and the idea of how important nature is to the world itself. Does anyone have any questions for Amy? If not, I have some questions that I came up with during your talk. Yeah, so in the UK a few years ago, there was an advert on TV about orangutans in Borneo and the destruction of their habitats. And it was in the cartoon form. And after there was a big controversy over this advert as it got taken off by the regulators. But there was a massive uproar on social media about the regulators taking this advert off. And I'm just wondering how we can harness this momentum from situations like this instead of it just being a flash in the pan.
Yeah, and this is, you know, I think so often we as a sector, when we do pay attention to communications, we focus on silver bullets. We focus on like the message that will change everybody once and for all. And we don't recognize that actually it's silver buckshot that works better. You need a lot of different messengers that relate to a lot of different communities. And after you get your myth right, you need to have community organizing. You need to have people who are working in specific communities to bring people together around these ideas on a regular basis and to engage them regularly. So I really focused on the communications aspect, but we absolutely, as a sector, need more community organizing. And I think in the United States, when we really started to see momentum around climate was when groups like 350.org, and a couple of others started these local chapters where people could engage with the idea in their communities and bring more support. And the level of social proofing and organization and coordination that happened around that really began to mobilize people and to sustain that energy that happens when you have flash in the pan incidents, and to keep it going. So I absolutely believe that conservation needs to focus on similar types of activities.
So if I'm right, it's very much about grassroots activity and building from the bottom up, and NGOs can support that in any way that is possible, I guess. And just one final question to round off your talk. What role do traditional stories, Indigenous stories, First Nation stories have in the conservation movement, the modern conservation movement of today? Are there messages of ecocentrism very important to getting the public on side with in order to reach the goals that we want to reach?
Yes, 100%. And of course, we need to recognize that Indigenous stories belong to Indigenous people, and that it's best when they're told by Indigenous people. But I think we also need those rare and powerful individuals who can cross cultures, who belong to one culture, but can speak to or speak from effectively from another. Because the indigenous stories, I think, play a huge part in this, and there's so much wisdom that is embedded in them. And they oftentimes may or may not resonate with other audiences. And so I think, and I think there are just an army of indigenous storytellers who do this and do it well. Sherman Alexie is one of them. I mean, I don't think he's done it a lot around conservation, but there are so many people that can do this and do it well. And we absolutely need to be incorporating them more into our sector, from indigenous and traditional communities around the world.
Great. Thank you very much, Amy, for your really, really wonderful insight into communicating in the field of conservation and how we can get a message out to the wider public. So we appreciate you being with us and the time that you've given up to join us here during the International Wilderness Week.
Thank you. It was my pleasure.